Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Emmanuel Church in Leftwich. It's great that you've been able to join us, and we're very pleased this evening to have our guest to be interviewed, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. She spent much of her life explaining and speaking about the Christian faith and how it answers some of the deepest questions of life. She's a regular speaker on TV and radio. She's even addressed politicians this side of the Atlantic and across in the States as well. And this evening, I'm very pleased to be able to chat with her about her recent book. And I've got it here. Where is God in All the Suffering? This is a recent book that Amy has written. And as we do the interview, there may be questions that come to mind. And if you'd like to text them in, they've got the number here, just up here. I can read it out as well, 07789 598 062. And if there are any questions that are sparked by our interview and what Amy has to say, please send those in, and we'll try and cover some of those questions at the end of the interview. But without further ado, Amy, it's great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and hi, everyone. Yeah.
First of all, it'd be nice to just find out a little bit about you and yourself. Tell us a little bit about you, your family, and what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm Amy, and I'm married, and I have 3 boys. They're all teenagers. So I've got twins who are 16, and my little one, the baby, who's 13 and same height as me now, about to overtake me. And we live just outside of Oxford. And I work really as a kind of theologian and writer, but really focused on the questions that people have about life and meaning, and how our questions about what it means to be human, how they interact with the Christian faith. And so I love talking to people who aren't believers, who wouldn't consider themselves to be religious, and really hope to be able to communicate something of who God is and why God might be of relevance actually to life and of interest, surprisingly, in our culture today.
Yes.
So I go and give talks in different places and do interviews like this, and do a little bit of writing as well.
Great. Well, we're really pleased that you've got the time to join us, and thank you for doing so. What motivated you to write this book? Because where is God in all the suffering? I don't know if you started that before the lockdown and everything, but it's certainly a timely book for our age. But I guess it's always timely, isn't it? So, kind of what motivated you to put pen to paper on this subject?
So I did actually write it in most of it, pretty much all of it, sort of before the pandemic, and I was finishing it off really, and obviously then did write a little bit about the pandemic in 2020 as well. And I think by that point I'd been doing the kind of work that I do for more than 20 years, and met a lot of people who for whom this question, how could God be loving and this be the world there is, that was just the question that loomed the largest for a lot of people that I met. And I think I felt that I believe that the Christian faith has something really profound and really unique to offer us as human beings, as and when we suffer and in this suffering world. But I found that a lot of sort of resources, or a lot of the way the church might speak about suffering, would be to kind of imagine suffering almost as this blob. Here's an answer from the Bible, and you kind of apply it to the blob, and then that's job done. And actually the way we experience suffering feels deeply personal and very specific, not this kind of general blob. And actually the Bible has multifaceted really profound and wonderful different kinds of responses that connect with us. So in the book, I explore the experience of suffering through violence. And actually, that's really different from an experience of suffering that is about loss, the loss of a loved one, including, maybe someone a parent who's lived a good life and to an old age, but there's still this deep grief and loss that we experience as human beings. And that's different from, chronic illness or, being unwell for a long time. And that's different from going through kind of natural disasters or the experience of a pandemic, which is suffering that's affecting everyone in a kind of corporate or communal experience of suffering. And so, and then mental health and other things. So in the book, I really wanted to, because I believe God actually is serious about us as people and about the kind of specific suffering we experience. And to listen to people and to listen to the type of pain that a person might be going through, and then see whether the Christian faith has something to say to that, not just sort of suffering in general.
That's very helpful. I guess someone might say, listening to you now, you were going to write this book on suffering, and obviously, I think from what you're saying, you certainly coming at it from a personal point of view. I suppose it's a fair question to ask is, what about your own life? And there's a certain sort of qualification to write a book on suffering, perhaps not just at a theoretical level, but at a personal level. So would you be willing to share any aspects of your own life, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I do that, as well as, where my life has interfaced with people that I'm close to. So as the book opens, one of my very close friends had just died. She was a mother of three. Her youngest baby was about 5 weeks old when she died. She died unexpectedly. And, I was holding her child at her funeral, knowing this daughter won't remember her mother. I've experienced other kinds of suffering as well, physical illness and ailments, and then obviously grief and loss, bereavement of family members. And my husband is also a trauma survivor, a survivor of child abuse. And so sort of walking through very closely in your marriage and family relationship, recovery from profound abuse, of childhood abuse. So there's a chapter on mental health as well that touches a little bit on what it means to be a trauma survivor in this world. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, because while not everyone's experienced, childhood extreme abuse, lots of us now in this moment in history, including in kind of prosperous, wealthy nations, are experiencing trauma to different extents. So,
yeah. So I guess the book, in a sense, is not just born out of your studies on thinking, but also out of your own heart, really. In those kind of.
I feel quite deeply that addressing this kind of question, if it can't connect with someone who's experienced sexual assault, or someone who's experienced the devastating loss, death of someone close to them, or someone who's received a really, really hard diagnosis, then it's not actually an answer, And the heart of the Christian faith is this claim that God is not far off from us, that in Christ, God actually came close to us as human beings, and that on one level that, our suffering and our experience of life is kind of very profoundly dignified. It matters deeply, just to us, but actually to God.
Very good, thank you. Let's go on a little bit more about the book, because in chapter 1, you entitled it "Why," I think,
Yeah.
and you write, "The instinct to ask why is deeply human." Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think we're constantly asking why, I guess, when we're looking out at a world that doesn't seem to be right?
Yeah. Well, from as a Christian, I think there are a number of answers to that. But I think the first thing I'd want to say is just stop and think about that for a moment. That as human beings, as opposed to other animals and creatures, we instinctively ask why. So we don't just passively accept when bad things happen. We don't just shrug our shoulders either to ourselves or when bad things happen to other people. And I think that's pointing to something deep and profound about what it means to be human. And from the perspective of the Christian faith, even that instinct, that intuition to question and to ask why is pointing to something deeply true about us, that we're not just the biochemistry of our bodies, we're not just a random collection of atoms, slime, here by chance, but that actually life has a transcendent source. Life is a gift from God. The Bible talks about human beings being created in the image of God. And whether we believe in him or not, whether we acknowledge God or not, some aspect of that truth that we're made in the image of God is likely to come through if it's actually true. And I think the instinct to even ask why is one of those pointers. It's a kind of flag that's saying even my own mind, my own feelings about suffering are telling me that I am worth something. Why is this happening to me? I
Right.
can't just accept that this is totally random.
Right. Yeah. You cover a lot of different aspects, as you've mentioned in the already in the book from that chapter 1. Which of those issues, which of the chapters did you struggle with, or did you find the most challenging to write about? I mean, there's quite a variety, as you've mentioned,
Yeah.
from violence to mental health and harm and
Yeah.
all those, I guess.
Yeah. So I think one of the ones I found hardest to write about begins with the story of Grenfell Tower. My husband is a church leader like you, actually, and after the fire sort of broke out, we had been working alongside some Christians who were serving in that community, which is quite a sort of poor area of London, an area of real need. And they invited us to come and kind of lead, because everybody like locally had been up all night for sort of 2-3 nights after the fire, just serving. And practically they invited us to come and sort of lead or help pull together a public kind of service just in the streets for anyone who wanted to come. And it was a really amazing experience, horrific experience, because there were lots of relatives of people who'd been killed in the fire who were there. And the Bible passage that had been chosen to be read was from a psalm, and it talks about how people are precious, and it's this kind of psalm of praise, and then it talks about how the wicked will be cast to the ground. And so someone from the community was just reading this psalm, Hebrew poetry written thousands of years ago. Most of the people standing there at this service, maybe 1,000 people, but the vast majority wouldn't be found in church on a Sunday, but were sort of drawn to this. But as they heard those words from the Bible written, people began to clap and applaud. And it kind of took my breath away. Here was this sense of something so horrific and so outrageous that had happened, that it caused people who don't believe in God, who wouldn't describe themselves as Christians, to applaud and clap the idea that there might be judgment, that there might be accountability for when something truly evil and horrific like this happens. And so I wanted to write about, how could there be a God and this be the world that is, and use, if you like, that intuition that I saw and experienced in the midst of people who were really suffering. But even though their worldview, like not really believing in God, might tell them, you're just here by chance, you're just the biochemistry of you, there's no God, everything is random. Everything within them, the rage that one felt, actually pointed to a deeper truth, a bigger truth, that there is a final judgment and there is an accountability above us as human beings. And that appeared to be a truth that was recognizable to people as they were suffering. So just like our instinct to ask, why is this happening, points towards God, not away from him, I think our rage when we see violence, when we see injustice in this world as human beings, that points to a deeper truth beyond what a godless kind of framework can offer us. Because on one level, why should we be outraged at the suffering of people we have no evolutionary predisposition to need them to survive? Why should we be outraged on the level we are at human suffering if all we are is just the stuff, the physical stuff of our bodies? It doesn't make sense. But we do experience rage. We do experience devastation in the face of suffering. And that points to a profound truth about us as human beings, that we're more than the biochemistry of a body, because we've been made in the image of God.
Okay. Having said what you've just said, though, I guess you do a lot of talking with people who are not from the Christian faith, and you must have come across some people who say, well, I can't believe in God anymore because of something that's happened to them. I'm sure you've had that kind of conversation. Would it be easier sometimes to be an atheist because you don't have to struggle with somehow the goodness of God in the face of suffering and evil? Isn't it easier to say, well, there is no God, so we'll just get on with life? What would you say to that kind of a response?
Yeah, sure. I certainly understand why people question the existence of God when suffering happens. And by the way, that actually happens in the Bible. The Bible has people articulating, where are you, God? How can this be happening? In all sorts of contexts of war and loss and devastation. So in the context of believing in and loving God when suffering happens, that can very profoundly shake the foundations of belief. I certainly have empathy for that and do understand that. But I think it's my experience, and actually if you look in literature and wider culture as well, that atheism doesn't necessarily really help that, or help that situation, because all sorts of other things collapse once you get rid of the idea of God, or you get rid of God's presence. The value of human life, this sense of the image of God being one of them. And I think at the centre of Christian understanding of who God is and what it means to be human is this idea that God is love, and that he's made us in his image. He's made us as beings who have the capacity to love, and the possibility of love is being real. But love can't be compelled, it can't be forced. If it's forced, then we're robots, and it's not really love. We're just being made to react in the way that the person with more power requires or wants. But God makes a world in which love is possible, and that means a world in which the beings who have the capacity to love have the ability to withhold love, and the possibility of harm then enters the world. And in the beginning of Genesis, it talks about that between chapters 1 and 3, what that really looks like, what our exercise of choice as human beings has done to us, to our relationships with each other, and even actually to the environment, to the world. So what I fear with atheism, although I really empathize with someone who suffered something horrific and thought, why didn't God do something to stop it? Actually doesn't solve the problem, because the goodness of this world and the meaning of life that we all see and experience is a fruit of being made in the image of God and that possibility of love. And unfortunately, the reality of suffering and harm is also a consequence of the possibility of love. That's how the Bible positions it. But also the other thing you lose if you give up on God, and I've touched on this with Grenfell Tower, is you lose the possibility of that final accountability. And actually, the beginning of the Bible, introduces this possibility of love and this kind of explanation of why there's suffering in the world. And the end of the Bible speaks of a God who, because he is loving, is a God who judges evil. And so when we experience horrific loss, when we experience horrific suffering or violence, God existing in a way is a source of hope, because we're not left in an utterly hopeless situation, because this life is not all there is. And also we can trust him to do right by us and actually to hold evildoers accountable. And I think that's a massively significant aspect of Christian hope. That atheism, doesn't have that to offer.
Cannot provide the comfort. Yes, I understand. Okay, so moving on. Let's say somebody rejects outright atheism, but then may say, well, all religions really provide some kind of explanation, don't they, for suffering? What is it that you would say Christianity is unique in that sense? What does Christianity offer that's unique other than all religions' sort of outlook on suffering?
Sure. So broadly, there are myriad of options, but broadly, we could, if we're going to do a bit of a comparative study, we could look at kind of Eastern religion, within which Hinduism and Buddhism broadly would fall, and like philosophical Hinduism at least, and ideas of karma. I don't know how many people on this call right now would have heard that. I think it's quite frequently now, including people who wouldn't necessarily be Buddhist, but it's a really central idea to Eastern religions. And that basically says that there's a kind of like cosmic law of cause and effect, and people get what they deserve. And so, if you apply that to a context of suffering, any suffering that you experience, you deserve it. That's what the worldview tells you. And it may be that you haven't done something to deserve it in this life. It may be a previous incarnation, but there's a sort of harshness to that framework, which is often seen as, quite kind of fluffy and lovely in Christianity, is the judgmental one, but actually that law of karma is a sort of difficult thing to live with if you are the victim and you are the person who is suffering. And then within Islam, broadly speaking, Islam is a deterministic, fatalistic religion. So that phrase, inshallah, that you might have heard, God willing, kind of encapsulates the idea that's central to Islam, which is that there's only really one will in the universe. It's God's will. And so what happens is God's will, and we have to accept it. So there isn't the same theology or idea of human beings either expressing choice or because of this capacity to love, or experiencing accountability for our actions and decisions that you find in the Christian faith. And then obviously within atheism, which I would suggest in a way is like a faith, it's like a religion as well, it's a worldview. You have this sense that there's no God, all that there is material things. And your body, your own experience of life, all that you are is the matter of your body. So I think what the Christian faith has to offer uniquely with regard to suffering, when you compare it with those three other options, is that it offers a credible explanation as to how human beings can experience and long for meaning and experience good things like love and purpose in this world and relationships, and have this sort of intuitive sense of the worth of life and that suffering actually matters because we've been made in the image of God. And then this story, this truest of true stories, actually, which happens in history of God entering history in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and God showing himself to us and demonstrating who he is, and ultimately doing that by suffering. So one of the most famous Bible verses is God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. So the crucifixion of Jesus, this moment of God's suffering, is a demonstration of love. So the Christian faith offers us relationship with a God who has suffered in Jesus, and then ultimately also that there's this accountability. So when we are the victim, when we experience horrific suffering, there is ultimately this God who judges. So for me, I have done a lot of comparative study, and for me, this question of all questions is what draws me to Christ and to the Christian faith.
That's really helpful. I guess for many, the question of suffering is pretty immediate. It's not particularly necessarily we've thought it all through. I was hearing a woman on the BBC News, from Ukraine, crying out in anguish when a city had been devastated. And in translation, what kind of a God would allow this? And I think we can all identify with that kind of a question, especially when we see what's been happening across in Ukraine in recent weeks. Can you really believe in the God of the Bible, a God who we're told is a God of love, and yet he's also almighty, so he's in control? And then, as you've said, a God of justice. I mean, when the experiences hit you, is it possible to hold on to faith in that kind of a God?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. We have two Ukrainian women staying with us who've experienced, similar to that lady, the destruction of their home and everything that they hold dear, and have loved ones left back in Ukraine fighting. And I really understand that question. And again, I would want to say that reaction, where is God? How could he be loving? That you read that sort of question and reaction in the Psalms, you read it in Lamentations. The Bible includes sentiment like that, prayers like that. And I think I would just say two things. One is that as we look at that situation, and we're not Ukrainian, we observe it from outside. My faith in a loving God informs my belief that every single life lost there really matters. And it matters on not just a nationalistic level, because I'm not Ukrainian. It matters profoundly, and it really that those lives mattering is rooted in something transcendent, something bigger than us, something bigger than emotion, or bigger than, it's just going to be the next thing on the news that happens. And that means that a loving God is for those who are suffering. A loving God calls his followers, Christians and people who are followers of Jesus, to do something about that suffering. And belief in a loving God gives us hope that there will be accountability for those who have wrought this destruction, that this world and this life is not all that there is. And although the perpetrators of that evil and violence may evade human justice, and history tells us most likely many of them will evade human justice, but they will not evade divine justice. So the lives that have been lost matter, they matter profoundly. And actually there's hope in a God who ultimately will judge. And then also that there's hope in a loving God who comes alongside and identifies with the suffering world so profoundly, not as an idea, but actually in Jesus having come and willingly suffered with us and for us, and offering us, as we go through the darkest possible experiences, relationship with him and hope beyond this world into eternity.
Would you say, I guess your job often is having to answer questions like this. Would you say that there's at times we have to admit there's a room for mystery in the whole issue of suffering, and we just have to, I guess, we don't necessarily have all the answers all the time, specifically why a certain thing has happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why one of the reasons that the Christian faith is really meaningful to me, and has been when I've gone through very dark and difficult experiences, is that there's a place and an invitation to ask the question and to articulate the pain, and even to say to God, I don't even know if I believe you exist, or if you're good or loving. And those statements are all there in the Bible. So if we're wrestling with this and struggling with this, we're really, really not alone. But we're doing it within a framework, at least within the Christian faith, of a loving God who actually identifies with and describes the suffering world we experience, and who enters it in Jesus and offers us the possibility of his presence, his comfort, his hope, relationship with him, even as we suffer, so that we're not alone as we do that. Because often what you really need when you suffer is not really an explanation, and it's not necessarily even a conversation. What you need is the presence of someone who loves you. And that's how Jesus describes God in this world, and that's who Jesus shows God to be, a God of love, who draws near to people, doesn't abandon people as they suffer.
So in some ways, I've got to be very careful as I frame this question, but in some ways you could say that there are positives to suffering in some ways. Would you say, because they open up a window to the possibility of perhaps considering or drawing near to God in a way that if we hadn't suffered, we may not have come to that experience? Would that be a fair question, or is that a difficult one to
be very careful about that? Because particularly people who've experienced abuse or sexual violence, I would hate for anyone to take away from this call that, as Christians sometimes might say, well, it's all going to be fine in the end. Actually, the depth and horror of that kind of experience, it may not ever feel like that could possibly be a good thing. But that's not to say that people who go through that kind of suffering don't often, having been through it, at some point come to a place where they are able to take something redemptive forward into their life, whether that's advocating for other victims or, like contending for goodness in this world and experiencing God's love in really amazing ways that maybe they couldn't have experienced or didn't experience previously.
Otherwise,
But I totally get what you're saying, but
Yes, it's a delicate one to phrase. Now, at the end of your book, you write, ultimately, at the heart of the Christian faith is the offer of a relationship with a personal God who isn't a system or a machine, but a loving Father. Um, it might be nice to hear about your experience. I mean, what has led you to write that sentence, perhaps in your own experience? How did you come to know God as personal and as a father?
Thank you for that question. Yeah. So I wasn't born into a Christian family. Initially, neither of my parents had been raised as religious at all. In fact, my grandfather was a brilliant scientist and very, very vociferous atheist. And my mum and dad both at different points in their 30s very, very profoundly encountered Jesus Christ. My dad was a university lecturer as well, and they had no sort of predisposition to be religious at all, but encountered sort of evidence for God, but also very sort of dramatic encounter with Jesus. And I saw a huge transformation in their lives, which impacted our whole family. And then subsequently myself as a teenager made a decision to follow Jesus, and then again as a university student and a young adult, really continued in that faith. And it's been my experience of God that in the darkest times in life, including bereavement, quite frightening diagnoses of illness, including pastoring and working amongst very kind of challenging communities, including kind of gangs, that sort of area. It's been my experience that God isn't just an idea, that his presence, his reality through Jesus Christ and through the Holy Spirit in our experience is a wonderful and beautiful thing, and that there's hope to be found in that relationship with him, which is a daily walk. And then often there are sort of really very tangible moments of experience of walking with him. So he's a giver of hope, a giver of peace, a giver of life. And of course, at the heart of the Christian faith, the most important offer is the offer of forgiveness. So when we go through suffering and wounds or violence or abuse have been inflicted on us, it can really harm us. But the truth is that even those of us who've experienced things perpetrated against us will, if we're honest, we know that we've also caused harm in this world to others. And the offer of Jesus is that we can be forgiven and our slate can be wiped clean, and we can live with an assurance of being loved, of being forgiven, and of having an eternal hope beyond death that is certain, that is sure. And so in this kind of anxiety-ridden time, there's a hope beyond circumstances, and there's a true forgiveness that we can receive through Jesus Christ today that isn't just theoretical. It's abstractly, concretely true. It's not just an emotional thing, but it also is experienced by believers. And I think that's really, really life-changing, whoever we are.
Yes.
It's just amazing.
Yes. Well, thank you for answering the questions that I put to you. If you're willing to talk about the book as well, we may have some questions that are texted through. So perhaps I could call Dave on and see if there's anything to respond to, Dave.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy, for what you've been able to share. It's been interesting to listen to, and we have got a few questions. If you're still got questions you'd like to ask, do send them in now. I'll be receiving them on text, and the number is 0778 959 8062 if you'd like to do that. But the first question, Amy, that we've had in is this one. It says, I suffered something truly traumatic in my life. What possible good can God mean to bring from that suffering?
Thank you for that question. So I think the first thing that I would want to say is I'm just so sorry that's been your experience, and that I think actually I wouldn't want to jump too quickly towards saying God is going to bring something good out of that suffering. I think one of the things it may well be that he does, but we can't possibly know what that might be right now at this moment. And actually the pressure to very quickly jump to what is the moral good that, what's the lesson here that I need to learn, or what's the moral good that's going to be the outcome, actually skips over a sort of deeply human processing that you might need to do. And the Bible isn't really requiring you to jump to what's the moral good. Actually, there's an identification of a loving God with this suffering world through the person of Jesus and his death by crucifixion, which was completely unjust on every level, but which he willingly died, willingly went to that cross, identifying with the trauma and unjust violence that many people in this world will experience. So I suppose I want to say to you that if God exists and if the God of the Bible exists, then the suffering and trauma that you have experienced matters, and it matters on more than a physical level, because you have been made in the image of God. Your life has a sacred value just by virtue of you being human. And more than that, God loves you, and Jesus died for you so that you could know God, so that you could experience his love and his forgiveness, not so that he can teach you a lesson, or so that there can be some moral good that comes out of your suffering. So I suppose I'd love you to just hear the gospel of God's love for you, even as you and I live in this fallen and broken world where horrific traumas happen to people who don't deserve them as a consequence of the sin and fallenness of this world. So that would be the first thing I'd say. And then I think I would want to say that there is hope in the Christian faith, that trauma doesn't have to define the whole of your life. It is going to be a significant experience of your life, but that relationship with God and help from services and therapy and all of that mean that your life doesn't have to be over, that there is hope beyond that trauma, and that hope can be found in relationship with Jesus. But I suppose I want for you to hear and to say that the Christian faith doesn't require you to jump too quickly to what's the lesson here. And we often do that in the church, and that's not the gospel of grace.
Thanks, Amy. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, like you said. Another question we've had is, you say God will ultimately judge evil, and in your example, those involved in the Ukrainian atrocities. Leading on from that, why doesn't he intervene and do it now?
That's a really massive question, and I'd just like to say that question is in the Bible. It's like Paul talks in the book of Romans and in other places in the New Testament about this sense of groaning and waiting and longing for the resolution of everything and the return of Jesus. And of justice and judgment actually coming where there is great evil. So I would want to kind of echo the heart of that question to just say that part of being a Christian is that longing. It's that longing and that hope for things to be made right. And so as Christians, I want to be honest with you. What I'm not saying is when you come to God and you have this relationship with God, everything feels great all the time, or everything is all set right now. We're living in a sort of tension that theologians call the now and the not yet, that Jesus has come in history, but there's also the promise of his return and that final day of judgment. So on one level, the answer to that question is, I don't know. I don't know why God hasn't wrapped up history yet, or brought an end to this, this specific conflict, other than that he's made us in a world in which love is possible, and in which as human beings we are held accountable for the choices that we've made ultimately. So we don't know the specifics of why God doesn't intervene, but we do know that one day he will set things right. And the promise of the end of the Bible is that God will wipe tears away from our eyes. That's a tremendously tender and specific action of a loving God on a face. I don't know if any of you've got children and have wiped tears from children's eyes. It's a very sensitive area. That's a promise of a loving God bringing comfort and restoration in eternity. And believing in a loving God also means that he will bring judgment, and he will settle justice eternally. And I think that's a cause for hope in the Christian faith that we can look forward to. But right now, obviously, we live in this tension.
Thanks for that. Just linked to that tension that we live in now, we've got a question here, probably from someone at our church, and they've asked, what's the role that our church should play to those who are suffering or broken? So maybe you can, just encourage us in this, and maybe also just speak to anyone, perhaps, I guess, in our community who might think, I'm going through all this, but the last place I want to be in is a Christian church. So how should this question is, what role should the church play to those who are suffering or broken?
Yeah, well, the calling for followers of Jesus is to follow him. And Jesus, when he described his manifesto, he turned to a prophet called Isaiah. And Jesus specifically turned to chapter 61, which talks about the manifesto, if you like, of bringing the justice and love and goodness of God to people who are suffering in this world. And so I believe that it's our calling to live that out practically as Christians, and there's great joy to be found in that. I mentioned earlier about these Ukrainian ladies. So one of them is a babushka who's about 80, and another is in her 60s, and they arrived where we live in a sort of rural area, and there's a where they're living is the context is a farm. And before the 80-year-old left, just escaping with one piece of luggage, she just felt prompted to pack into her luggage a little packet of seeds, with this sense of hope that she might live, A, and B, be able to plant them somewhere. And she's arrived, and she's now planted these amazing seeds on raised beds. And that's a lovely picture to me of what a privilege to be a follower of Jesus, to be someone who gets to serve in this broken world where people really are in pain, and try and show and demonstrate and encourage people to receive the love of Jesus in practical ways. So I think we can listen to the needs of our community and follow that manifesto of Jesus. If we're following him, that's what it's going to look like. It's going to look like bringing freedom to captives and good news for the poor and the brokenhearted.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's obviously a challenge to us, isn't it? But hopefully, if people would like to come along to Emmanuel Church, that'll be something that you'll experience with us. But thanks for that, Amy. I think the last question I've got here before I hand back to Dovan, is this one. What would be the one thing you'd leave? What would be the one thing you'd like to leave with someone who is in the midst of suffering tonight?
I think I'd like anyone who's suffering, who's listening to this right now, to hear that your suffering matters because you matter. And that is not just a platitude. If the Christian faith is true, then that is true at a really deeply profound transcendental level, that your personhood and your suffering really matters. You've been made in the image of God, that your life matters. And it's not just a material thing. You're not just a body, you're not just here by chance. Your life isn't random, that there's a loving God who's made you and who wants to come alongside you in this suffering world, who doesn't deny the pain or reality of suffering, but actually in and through Jesus wants to offer you forgiveness, life and hope, even in the midst of suffering. But most profoundly, that you matter and that your suffering matters at a really deep level because God exists and because he loves you.
Well, that's really helpful. Hopefully people have found tonight helpful, but I'll just pass back over to Dovan, who'll just finish off our call. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks very much. If you'd like to read this book, Amy's book we've been talking about this evening, there are some copies we have at the church. If you'd like a free copy, contact us through the church website, and we'd love to bring one around for you to read. And I'm sure if you'd like to hear a bit more from Amy, you can even visit her on her own website and find out a little bit more about some of the books she's written and the things that she's getting up to. We do want to thank you, Amy, for sparing the time to talk to us. Excuse me. And if anybody else would like to find out a bit more about the Christian faith, please visit the church website. There's a little course there called See for Yourself, and it takes you through reading Mark's Gospel, all about the life of Jesus and finding out about what he says and what he's done. That's something you can do in the quietness of your own home and do that. So you'd be very welcome to do that and join us next time. Join us on Sunday, or next time we have events like this. It'd be great to have you coming along. But Amy, thank you. And I'd like to say good night and thank you for sparing the time to come to us. And may God bless you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.